uh, where is it going to go? It goes to a page, and we are also going live on Facebook. So welcome and click got it. Welcome and welcome back, particularly those of you who are still here. I am enormously grateful and moved by your continued interest in this question. Who are we? Where do we come from? And today we're going to be concluding my sort of 3,000 year journey into that question, or I guess 8,000 year journey if you want to count it that way. I'm not coming right up to the contemporary age. I'm not going to try and deal with the Holocaust and the state of Israel as sort of byproducts of what's otherwise an hour-long class. Maybe I can come back and have an inappropriate and ultimately failed go to sum up everything that there is to say about the Holocaust or Israel at a later time. But today I'm looking at modernity. What do I think we've done so far? What I've tried to do in the biblical period particularly is to show the relationship between facts on the ground or under the ground, as it were, the archaeology and the narrative of the Bible, and allow those things to stand in sometimes creative tension, sometimes support, and sometimes denial. As we moved into the medieval period, I was looking at particularly the experience of Jews in other dominions. When other people are in charge, what does that do to us? And to summarize that really in a sentence, what I was suggesting is that the truth of the Jewish story is that we are always dealing with our surrounding culture as we move not only geographically, but also going through time. That wasn't a rabbi making the sign of a cross. That was me trying to make a point about the nature of Jewish identity. As we moved in, that was the ancient period. As we moved through the medieval period, I guess the big message was the instability and the fragility of the Jewish experience out of power. There was a lot of stuff about being expelled, exiled, and cast away. And we ended my entirely arbitrary designation of the medieval period before the entirely arbitrary beginning of the modern period with the story of the readmittance of the Jews back into England under Oliver Cromwell, 1656, that kind of period. And that's roughly where I'm going to pick up, although none of the things that I have talked about before change. In other words, the one constant throughout this entire scope of history is this process of a unfolding of something through time as we come into contact with different geographies and different temporal moments. Rabbi Natasha has just said, I've had a private chat request that I define modernity. It's arbitrary, but what and I could have cut it slightly one way or another way, but this is about the return of Judaism into the quotes civilized world, question mark. And we, spoiler alert, I'll be finishing in 1933, as it were, and the question mark I think still stands to this day. But as I've done before, what I'm going to be doing is looking through a chronology just so that we get a kind of broad sweep. And as we go through that broad sweep, I'll be pointing out where I'm kind of interested in jumping in and out of, and then I'll be sort of going back through some of these ideas. So, 1700, the Baal Shem Tov is born. So if you not hear anything about Hasidism, there's an earlier form of Hasidism which is not connected to this form of Hasidism. What's interesting about this form of Hasidism, especially as it evolves in the later part of the 18th century and the generations that follow the Baal Shem Tov, is that it gives simple Jews an experience of love, an experience of delight, an experience of being important and significant without banging them over the head with what by that point has become an extremely overcomplicated rabbinic series of learnings. If you know about the Talmud, the Talmud started with something quite brief, but that's the Mishnah. There's then the commentary on that, which is the Gemara, which is longer, and then there are then more commentaries on that, the Tosafot, which start bouncing one area of it against another, and more commentaries and more commentaries and more commentaries. So in the kind of mid to late part of the 18th century, you've got this kind of Hasidic experience, which is, just go out in the field and experience the beauty of a personal connection with God. I mean, there are many forms of Hasidism, but that's one which is really, I think, particularly significant. Devekut, cleaving to God, and then a kind of a against that, holding on to Judaism as this very heavy, very complicated, very text-based. I mean, there is a spirituality in there, but it's really, you've got to learn. And you've got this sort of setup between Hasidism on the one hand and what gets called mitnagdish or mitnaged Judaism, literally opposed to. And it's interesting, of course, because the Vilna Gaon is the previous thing, right? That's what Judaism was, very, very ascetic, rather than aesthetic. And yet the Vilna Gaon becomes the against it. Interesting, who changes, who owns, what was original. All of these things are kind of meaningless. The first thing that we'll look at once we've made our way through the chronology is Moses Mendelssohn, an extraordinary figure. And if you want to trace the origin of enlightenment, the Hebrew term for that, Haskalah, perhaps the origin of progressive Judaism, certainly the origin of a kind of Judaism in Ashkenaz, of course, because of in the Arabic worlds, and we looked at that when we were looking at Rambam and the Cairo Geniza at that time. It's a different story, but in Western Europe, this sense that Jews can and should and need to work in the very, very best of circles of the cultured world around them, then we need to kind of tell the story of Moses Mendelssohn. By the time we get into the 19th century, I have one of my absolute favorite insights into modernity. Again, defining modernity as the encounter with the modern civilized world with inverted commas and question marks, right? And that is this extraordinary story of Napoleon's, I've used the word invited, that's the wrong word, command, that the leaders of Jewish communities in the French Empire turn up to a Sanhedrin. I'll say much more about that later. When I went to kind of pull a chronology, and I went obviously to Wikipedia, and I was absolutely charmed to see that Wikipedia has as a chronology for the date 1820 to 1860, the development of Orthodox Judaism. It's absolutely right. It's not true that Judaism was always Orthodox, because Judaism was always responding to things, and indeed orthodoxy is responding to things of its contemporary moment. So orthodoxy is a new thing. In some ways, orthodoxy post-dates Moses Mendelssohn and Haskalah. So I just wanted to sort of include that, just because it kind of, I think it absolutely understands what history is as a Jewish narrative, this changing, unfolding bounce, like a kind of like a ping, like a ball in pinball. Do I mean that? Like, yeah, pinball, like the arcade game, where it's bouncing backwards and forwards, it's going up, it's going down, there's gravity, but there's counter forces. So you can feel and see all of that in Orthodoxy just as much as you can in any other form of Judaism, including our own, including Reform. And again, look at this sentence. I'm just sort of intrigued by this. I don't know who wrote this. It's Wikipedia. It could be 1,000 people. It could be one person. 1868. We're in England. Benjamin Disraeli becomes Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Though converted to Christianity as a child, he is the first person of Jewish descent to become a leader of government in Europe. What a fantastically interesting sentence, starting to suggest that the surrounding, quotes, civilized, I'm going to stop using quotes, Western communities of Europe like something about Jews, but not too much of it. That you can bring some of your Jewishness to the top table, but not all of it. And exactly what is acceptable and what is not acceptable will ebb and flow and change, but we're still kind of here, although what is accepted is very different from what was accepted in 1868. clearly. There's a famous joke where somebody says, it's an American joke. He said, "We have reached the point that a Jewish person could enter the White House just as long as they don't want to be the president," right? You know, like that kind of a question. 1875, the Hebrew Union College is founded in Cincinnati, and I will be saying something about the Trafe Banquet, sometimes called the Trafer Banquet. 1883, we will catch up with that point. World Jewish population, you know, what's going on at this point? 90% of Jewry is in Europe, mostly in Eastern Europe, with about 3.5 million, so about sort of, I don't know, my maths is terrible, 43 or 48% of the total population of Judaism in the former Polish provinces, which is to say, I'm spending time talking about what's going on in Berlin, in Germany, in Paris, in France, in Britain, but that we're the very much the minority. The vast majority of Jews are living in Poland, and they are involved in Hasidic Judaism, Nugget Judaism, a pre-European Judaism, and a non-enlightened Judaism. That is to say, they're not dealing with modernity, partly because Poland, you know, wasn't dealing with modernity. I mean, these are huge sweeping statements, but, you know, they were pre-modern in a way that wasn't true about places like Berlin or Paris or London at that time. So just important for us to sort of understand that. You know, again, I am guilty of Ashko normification in this, talking too much about Ashkenaz Judaism, not enough about Sephardi Judaism, but, you know, 10% of the population of Judaism, less than that, right? Because you've got America as well. Not that high percentage of world Jewry is Sephardi at this time. How do I do this? There we go. 1897, the Dreyfus Affair. I'm not going to spend much time talking about that today, but it leads Theodor Herzl, who was there as a journalist, to write the Judenstaat. There was developing at this time, and I will say more about this, the notion of, quote, the Jewish question, which is, you know, what should, asked on one side, the non-Jewish side, we do about the Jews, and asked on the other side, we do as Jews. Can we ever truly fit into Western cultural civilization? You know, do we need to change to fit in? Do they need to change to accept us? You know, now talking as the non-Jews, you know, is it a matter of ethics to accept Jews? Is it a matter of racial theory that we don't accept Jews? All of these things are kind of swimming around, and in that vibrancy and in that scary time, Theodor Herzl watches this Jew who never had a chance, right, of being able to be a loyal French military officer because they were, you know, trumped up charges, prosecuted for treason. And that's the beginning of this modern Zionist Congress, which of course, you know, becomes the Jewish Agency and the State of Israel in 1948. Interestingly, 1903, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, some of the classic lies and libels that have been told about Jews all the way through, you know, regurgitated, wrapped up anew, that there is a cabal. Listen to that word, that English word from Kabbalah, right? You know, a group of secretive Jews who control the X, they control the Y, and they control the Z. And in that same year is the Kishinev pogrom, caused by accusations that Jews practice cannibalism. I mean, you know, none of this has any relationship to who we are as Jews, but stories are told about us, you know, and let's just sort of check in that happens to all others, to all foreigners, to all outsiders, that we become sponges for, unwilling sponges for uneasiness with otherness, fear of our employment security, and you know, them taking our daughters away, all of that, you know, which we've seen so many times, we've experienced very much. And I will spend time with what I think is one of the most extraordinary pieces of literature as history that I know, which is Chaim Nachman Bialik's poem, The City of Slaughter. And we'll be delving into that. 1917, the end of the First World War, the British defeat the Turks, gain control of Palestine, and Lord Alfred Balfour writes this Balfour Declaration, where the British mandate over Palestine, by the way, most of which will be hived off as a state for Jordan, a trans-Jordanian Palestine, nonetheless is expressed as being the British government view with support the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. What does that mean? I don't know, but it strikes me as worth dropping in here in this sort of what we now call the interwar period. And then just another a numbers check, 1930, 15 million Jews. And now look at that rise in the United States. There has been, over the course of the past, whatever it is, 30, 40 years, an enormous flow of Jews from the Veldt, from the Pale of Settlement, from Poland, which still, 3.5 million Jews, Soviet Union, 2.7 million Jews. That 2% doesn't strike me as correct, but never mind. Maybe that should be 12. No, I can't remember what that number is. Never mind. Sorry, ignore that number. I apologize. The percentage of Jews to the Golden Medina, to this sort of new promise of a new land where you can reinvent yourself and you can start again. And I will be talking about that as we move through. Yeah, I don't know what those percentages are. Oh, sorry. Oh, I see. Sorry, I understand now. It's 11% of the total population of Poland, 2% of the total population of the Soviet Union. Of course it is. 6% of the total population of Romania, 17% of the total population of Palestine. 1933, I can't not do this, but it's one of the things I've always tried to do at the synagogue, and those of you who come regularly will know, I never give half of a sermon about the Holocaust. If I'm going to talk about the Holocaust, I don't want to talk about anything else, because I don't know how you could. So Hitler becomes the Chancellor of Germany in 1933, and then how do I end? Right, periodization. Whenever I would do these history courses at JTS, the first lecture would always be on periodization. It's rather boring, but I just thought that I would end my chronology with two, I think, really interesting moments. 1935 in Berlin. Regina Jonas becomes the first woman to be ordained as a rabbi. What have I said about women so far in my 3 and something hours? Precious little. That's largely, of course, because we don't have artifacts. My literature is so male as a rabbinically educated Jew. And even what comes out of the ground, to see that as to see the female contribution as important. A, there's not as much of it, and B, it takes effort to create a space to acknowledge the history of the kitchen, when on the other hand you have the Babylonian Gate of Ishtar, right? This enormous sort of male I don't know what you would call it, kind of phallic symbol, but I didn't want to do this whole thing and not acknowledge the most extraordinary change that has happened to society at large over the course of the latter part of the 20th century and unto today, and the job's not done. But kol hakavod to Rabbi Regina Jonas and all the extraordinary women who have followed in her footsteps. And then I thought I would just finish with this. 2 years ago, Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz passed away, and he wrote a line-by-line commentary of the Babylonian Talmud, which is unbelievable because the last person to do it was Rashi. And why do I end with Adin Steinsaltz? Because I met Adin Steinsaltz. When I was in Israel, it was well known that Adin Steinsaltz would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and do 3 hours of work, play with his children for 2 hours, grandchildren for 2 hours, and then come and daven at the late hour of 9 o'clock. And I knew where I could find him for Shacharit, and I went to find him for Shacharit to express my gratitude to him. And that ties me into history. I knew him, and for those of us who perhaps I'm not sure exactly who's online tonight, or still know and still have opportunities to speak with people who are bearers of our history as Jews, particularly people who have lived through the horrors of the Holocaust. Carpe diem to hear stories and share and learn, because history is best when immediately understood. Enough chronology. Let's jump in. Who is Moses Mendelssohn? I mean, the most extraordinary man. I mean, he felt of himself, he wrote about himself that he was very physically ugly. He's the gentleman sat on the left in the print. He's talking to Ephraim Lessing, one of the great playwrights of Germany at the age. He wrote this extraordinary play about an enlightened Jew based on Mendelssohn, a Jew who was not, in that kind of Streicher imagery, hunched over, money grabbing, leery at non-Jewish women, but instead a remarkable human being who needed to be acknowledged as a human being. And take a look at Mendelssohn sat there. There is nothing demeaning about this. There is nothing that is ugly in the way in which he is sat with the chessboard there, sign of civilization. It's that word again. Maybe that's the definition of modernity that I really do mean. There are books, there's beautiful garments. He's not objectified as a Jew. He is simply part of intelligentsia, and this is the emergence of Moses Mendelssohn. So what have I got for you today? I've got a bit of writing and a couple of pictures. The writing I've taken from Moses Mendelssohn's most important book, Jerusalem. And this is how Moses Mendelssohn opens his book. Hey, that's a word, right? Jerusalem. But listen to this. One of the most difficult tasks of political theory concerns state and religion, civil and ecclesiastical constitution, and secular and churchly authority. By the way, as an Englishman in the 18th century, I hear that. I know about Henry VIII. I know about the dissolution of the monasteries. I know about tensions between the Catholics and the Protestants, all of this kind of stuff. Mendelssohn goes on. The task is to relate these pillars of social life to one another in such a way that they are in balance, rather than becoming burdens on social life or weighing down its foundations more than they help to uphold it. Men, forgive his androcentricity, he's writing in the 1800s, have struggled with this for centuries, occasionally getting somewhere with it, but only in practical settlements rather than any theoretical solution. Some thought it right to separate these different relations of social man into two moral entities. But I don't need to finish this. But let's just acknowledge what he's trying to do, what he's set as his task. He's set as his task solving the problems of society. So, by which he doesn't mean Jewish society, by which he means German society. He's writing for Germans. He's writing to help out Germans. And yes, he's called it Jerusalem. And yes, there's plenty that's interesting Jewishly, but his audience isn't a Jewish audience. He's trying to express these ideas in a universal manner, writing as, I'll use the term popular academic, but can you feel the modernness of the way in which Moses Mendelssohn is writing? As a child, Moses Mendelssohn wrote an essay for some, I tried to look it up, it might be apocryphal, I couldn't quite work out the details. He won an essay prize for some, philosophical essay as a child. And in second place came Immanuel Kant, with whom Moses Mendelssohn had a relationship. They were in, as it were, chavruta together. The very, very best of world thought, and a Jew. That's modernity, right? That is the thing that changes, particularly in Berlin, in Germany, in this middle part of the 18th century. So that's one side of what Moses Mendelssohn is doing. He's trying to help the Germans in such a way that it will be easier to be the very person who he is, and a cultured but Jewishly committed German and Jew together, the hyphenation of identity. And this is the other side of what Mendelssohn is doing. He's trying to drag the Jewish community out of the ghetto, by which I mean the sort of self-imposed ghetto, the self-siloization of Jews into a place where they don't They don't care what's going on in society. They don't read what's going on in society. So he pulls them out. He writes this thing called Sefer Netivat HaShalom, the paths of peace. Can you see it? This is Chameshet Chumshei Torah, the five Pentateuchs of the fifth-fold Pentateuch of the Torah, published in big font. Berlin, center of the world. Look how proud he is of his place. There it is, there with that kind of glorious Germanic curlicues. He's proud of that. And what is this? It is a tikkun sofer. So he's published the Torah with an academic acknowledgement of different manuscript possibilities of how the Torah came to be. Gewalt, right, says the Orthodox, but he's got his Tikkun Soferim in there, with Targum Ashkenaz and a translation into the German. And if you can see here, you can see he's got Vayikra El Moshe. This is the opening, Vayikra El Moshe. This is the opening of Vayikra in Hebrew, translated into German, but German written in Hebrew letters. Why write German in Hebrew letters? Because who's the audience? It's people who can read Hebrew but can't speak German. This is an attempt to teach German to Jews. How do you teach German to Jews? You translate the Torah into German, but you can't use A, B's and C's because they don't know what an A is from a B and a C. Instead, you write it with Aleph, Bets and Gimels. It's a bit like that time when I was trying to work on my ability to read Hebrew, and I decided to read Harry Potter in Hebrew because I knew Harry Potter in English, and so I could kind of busk my way through things that I didn't understand. And that's what he's doing. He's writing this translation with, he wrote it by himself. So, it's an extraordinary achievement, fascinating. Not the first time that it's happened, but just interesting to think about Mendelssohn simultaneously pushing, on the one hand, German society to welcome Jews, and secondly, Jewish society to want to be part of Western civilized intelligentsia. He's right there on that sort of edge. And as part of that, he is re-articulating Judaism in such a way as to be the precursor of progressive Judaism, and certainly the precursor of reform. He wouldn't have known the word reform. He wouldn't have self-identified as reform. But we'll see some of the relationship between those attitudes and a document I'm going to look at in a little bit later, the Pittsburgh Platform. Okay. 1806, moving from Germany to France. Napoleon has a, quote, Jewish problem. What does he do about his Jews? And before he's going to say what he's going to do about his Jews, he's got a kind of like a first problem. His first problem is, who are you? And how do you fit into France? And somehow Napoleon decides to ask Count Molé, who becomes the fourth president of the Republic of France, right? I mean, he's a significant person, to bring together an assembly of Jewish notables. An assembly like the present has no precedent in the annals of Christianity, which, as far, of course, as Napoleon is concerned, means ever, right? I'm aware of at least one French person here today, so here we go, this is for you. Right, the wish of His Majesty, Napoleon, is that you should be Frenchmen. It remains with you to accept the preferred title without forgetting that to prove unworthy of being French would be to renounce being French altogether. So what Napoleon is saying via Count Molé is, are you in or are you out? You've got one option. Are you French or are you not? I'm not interested in your hyphenatedness. I want you to be clear as to how you place Judaism in the context of your Jewish identity. And for those of us who remember Tebbett's cricket test, it's the cricket test, right? You go, you're a West Indian living in England, and you go to the cricket, and England are playing the West Indies. Who do you want to win? It's exactly that. Look at these questions. There are 12 of them. I've only just brought you the first 6. Is it lawful for Jews to have more than one wife? I don't trust anybody with more than one wife, says Napoleon. I, as a Christian, as a Frenchman, would never possibly believe in such a thing, but I've read the Bible. Can you still have more than one wife? Is divorce allowed by Jewish religion? Again, divorce is not allowed in France? Is divorce valid, although pronounced not by the courts of justice, in contradiction to the French code? Here's a great question. May a Jewess marry a Christian? May a Jew marry a Christian woman? Or does Jewish law order that Jews should only intermarry among themselves? Who are you? Who are you? Whose side are you on? And then here comes these next, the 4 and 6 are really the absolute heart of this. In the eyes of Jews, are Frenchmen not of the Jewish religion considered as brethren or strangers? Boy, I mean, you have to imagine these rabbis shifting, and I'm going to show you the very seats on which they were sitting, shifting in their seats, struggling with how they're being forced, backed into a corner. Because, don't underestimate the threat to their very lives and the very lives of all the French Jews, of all Jews living in the French Empire, if this one went wrong. Do Jews, number 6, born in France, treated by the law as French citizens, acknowledge France as their country, are they bound to defend it? Right? This is the classic question, right? And I think it's asked in one of the subsequent questions. Are they, sorry, I skipped 7. I shouldn't have skipped 7. 7 is, if there was a war and there were Jews on the other side, who would you fight with? The French against the Jews or the Jews against the French? I'm not having any of your, let me use the word, Talmudic answers here, right, says Mole. You in or are you out? At this point, the assembly responses one, to the death. That was to question 7, sorry. On whose side are you? I've only got an hour to do all this. Sorry, I just got that slightly wrong. But can you feel the test of whether or not you as a Jew, are you modern or are you ancient, right? Are you one of us or are you one of them? Can I trust you? I mean, it's completely watertight. I mean, I hope you appreciate why I find this so significant as a moment in history. Yeah. Here are them seats. The top right-hand corner, there is Count Mole reading at the table, reading these questions out before this assembly of Jewish notables. And look where they've stuck them, in the Hotel de Ville. Oh my goodness, I mean, it's that classic experience of being brought somewhere where the tea is being served on fine china and you don't know fine china. You don't know how to arrange your soap, But look, they don't look too bad, these Jews sitting there. They've scrubbed up. They've worked out how to appear in French society. There was a coin that was, a medallion, that was pressed in honor of this day. There was a special siddur that was produced with a prayer. This is the bottom right. Prière de membres du Sanhedrin. I'll say a bit more about that word Sanhedrin in just a second. It was a major, major moment. I love this stuff. And hey, look, we got pictures, right? Not photographs, but we're entering into the modern period, and things have survived that we can kind of look at. Look at this rabbi. Is he Jewish? Is he French? He's wearing a gown. He's still got a beard. He's got a hat. Everybody's got a hat, but what kind of a hat? You can look around and start kind of understanding all of these moments. Here comes the response. The assembly, impressed with a deep sense of gratitude, love, respect, and admiration for the sacred person of his imperial and royal majesty, declares, right? They know on which side their bread is buttered. They are you can feel, already what the answer to all these questions is going to be, right? Already what they're going to say about whether or not a Jew can marry a French person who isn't Jewish. Already what they're going to say about any questions which are complicated. What if Judaism says you can get divorced and the French law says that you can't? It's all there in that very opening moment. I think that's why I like this way of teaching history. Those of you who are still with me, I'm glad you're still with me. The chronology is helpful and important, but when you drop into textual evidence or, evidence of any kind, and you start really critically reading it, all the color is there. Right, what do they say? In the name of all Frenchmen professing the religion of Moses, no 2 Jews, 3 opinions going on here. It's too dangerous. It's too dangerous. We are fully determined to prove worthy of the favors of His Majesty intends to them. Right, we know that, they're like dogs. I understand it. I'm not judging it. But you can almost see them sort of like propping themselves up on their hind legs, looking for this crumb to be dropped from the table by scrupulously conforming to Napoleon's paternal intentions. that their religion, that's Judaism, makes it their duty to consider the law of the prince as the supreme law in civil and political matters. Let me just explain that. Napoleon beats Torah, right, on civil and political matters. And the question will be, what counts as civil and political, what counts as religious? And those of us who know anything about France today, can you walk around with a hijab? Can you walk around with a Magen David? Can you, can you get married just in a synagogue? Like all these kinds of things that we know about France. It's all held in this story of the Sanhedrin. That consequently, should the Jewish religious code or its various interpretations contain civil or political commands at variance with those of the French code, those commands would of course cease to influence and govern us as Jews, since we must above all acknowledge and obey the laws of you, Napoleon, of being French. Right? In this challenge, as what do you give, what do you gain? What are you prepared to give? What are you forced to give? What are you going to be trusted to give up? Here stand the assembly of nobles and say you can have all the civil and political, and we'll see in a second what the civil and, how that falls at the tightest challenge, the tightest question. So this is the answer to the question on divorce, translated in this document as repudiation, right? So divorce is allowed by the law of Moses. Well, I know that because it says it so explicitly in Parashat Kitetse. Kitetse, right? Divorce is allowed by Torah, but it's not valid if it's not previously pronounced by the French code. In other words, we rabbis say that you, France, get to go first. And that if you, in the eyes of every Israelite without exception, by the way, that's a meaningless sentence. There has never been anything that has applied to every Israelite without exception. But here they are absolutely lining up perfectly. Submission to the prince is the first of duties. It's a principle generally acknowledged that in everything relating to civil or political interest, the Lord, they're just restating themselves, right? Just dropping down. Since the revolution, we Jews, right? They're talking about themselves in the third person. I don't know enough about French in that period to know how kind of deliberate that is and what we should read into their detangling themselves from their own Judaism to sound like French people talking about the Jews in the third person, right? Since the revolution, Jews have acknowledged no other laws on their head but those of the empire. At the epoch they were admitted to the rank of citizens, the rabbis and the principal Jews appeared before the municipalities at their respective places of abode and took an oath to conform in everything to the laws. Consequently, they can no longer consider as valid divorces that the rabbis have done, since were a divorce to be valid, it must have previously been allowed by the French. And since it's not allowed by the French, it's not allowed. Right? So out goes Torah. And it could not be clearer for the entire French Empire how the Jews have to behave. By the way, this is absolutely not going on in places like Poland. Very, very different kind of a narrative. But here there is an offer. And the Jews are, I don't know, do they really want it? Is it genuine? I think it kind of is. So how does Count Mole respond? This is from Jewish Encyclopedia. Expressed the satisfaction of the emperor with their answers and announced that the emperor required the pledge of strict adherence to these principles and called together a great Sanhedrin. So this is a very deliberate attempt to revive the old Sanhedrin of Jerusalem. The interesting thing about the Sanhedrin of Jerusalem, A, what they said went, but B, they had power as a Sanhedrin to do certain things, such as say, I don't know, you can't have any Jewish divorce if the French won't allow it, right? So, in comes the Sanhedrin. They sit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. There's no discussion on the replies, and they are passed unanimously, right? That's where that story goes. But this is from a sermon I gave once upon a time, right? And how does Napoleon? Count Mole thought that was fine. But when Napoleon's response comes back, there are new decrees against the Jews. The assembly the Jews had hoped that the state would take on the obligation to pay wages to rabbis in the same way that they pay wages to priests. No chance. The minister for cults was going to prepare a list of the only synagogues to be permitted in France. So if you were the kind of Jew who wasn't prepared to sign up to the complete acceptance of France's dominion, you weren't going to be permitted to have a synagogue. No freedom of religious getting together here at all. Then came back a third decree, which wound back earlier doctrines of emancipation, decret and femme. Any debt charged at a rate higher than 5% would be wound back to 5%. Any debt above 10%, you try to price gouge, you ain't getting none of it. It was a disaster, right? We've been suckered. So does modernity work? Is it a genuine offer? Is there any hope to be truly accepted as one of the comity of nations? Off to America, the Golden Medina. I mentioned before that there was a rabbinical school that was set up in the late 1870s, and for the first time in this new land, and we know what's coming. We know there are millions of Jews on their ways to America coming from Poland. There was for the first time Jews who were going to be educated to be rabbis, and English-speaking rabbis at that, right? No more Yiddish Judaism, modern English-speaking rabbinic rabbis for American Jewry. And to celebrate the ordination, there was a banquet to which all the faculty of Hebrew Union College were invited. And look at this. This again is one of my absolute favorite kind of artifacts. Little neck clams, brackets half shell. You know, those of you who don't know, that's not kosher. Filet de boeuf, right, French, because of course French is the language of civilized people, served with crab and shrimp and pomme duchesse, which is milchik, right? I'm sure you were worried about the milchik piece. I mean, it's staggering. It's absolutely staggering. Grenouille à la crème, right? Frogs, you know, could not be more treif, served with cream. I mean, you know, it's absolutely extraordinary. I was looking at this fabulous little article on this earlier today. He said, well, at least the wine was good. You know, these are very good wines. They're pushing the boat out, but in the most treif way. What on earth is going on? Well, let me just give you the response first, because it's of issue. It's of issue to us. This is, you know, Professor Rabbi, PhD, right? He's got a degree, who subsequently becomes the first president of the Jewish Theological Seminary, where I was ordained. Where before me, the first rabbinic ordainee was Rabbi Hertz of the Hertz Pentateuch, was ordained in not this world, right? This is not my rabbinical college, but this is the college that I did go to, right? The outrage, says Morris, perpetrated at last week's banquet was not unheard of among the Hebrew clergy of America. There's a whole bunch of people out there who feel like this. On several occasions of a public character, right? It's not bad enough that they eat treif privately. Men notably supposed to champion Torah sat at tables laden with the flesh of animals whose vital blood remained therein. Right? This is the law of Shechita, right? None of this stuff was being kosherly slaughtered and the blood was being drained. And with that of shratzim, which creep in ponds and on the ground. What made the Cincinnati entertainment in its audacious effrontery most humiliating to the cause and vexatious to believers is the remarkable event which principally brought it about, which is that Jews were being ordained for the first time in America. And look, what an own goal, what a self cutting off the nose. I mean, it's extraordinary. But where's it coming from? It's coming from the place of where reform was in the back end of the 19th century, which is not the same as where reform is today. But there was an attempt to articulate the nature of Reformed Judaism in 1885 in America, in English, and this is what it says. We recognize in the Bible, by the way, they're not talking about the Torah, they're talking about the Bible, they're using the English term, the record of the consecration of the Jewish people to its mission as the priest of the one God. Well, that's a biblical quote. And we value it as the most potent instrument of religious and moral instruction. We love Torah, right? We're going to talk about it in a very anglicized way, but we love it. We hold that the modern discoveries of scientific researches in the domain of nature and history, talking about evolution here, talking about biblical archaeology, are not antagonistic to the doctrines of Judaism. I'm not running from them, says the Reform grouping in 1885. The Bible just reflected the primitive ideas of its own age. I mean, interesting to call them primitive. I don't know how pejorative that adjective is in 1885, but they're saying, don't worry about the fact that the Bible doesn't make sense today, because it should just be judged of its own time. And at times clothing its conception of divine providence and justice, dealing with men in miraculous narratives. Ha 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 ha, say these rabbis. I don't believe the sea literally split. I don't believe that God literally opened up a hole to swallow up the generation of Korach. But it's great, the Torah, but don't overcook it. Don't think that it is more than it genuinely is, which is a thing of its time. We recognize in the Torah a system of training the Jewish people for its mission during its national life in Palestine, right? We recognize that the Torah was good for 3,000 years ago. But today we accept as binding only its moral laws. And we maintain only such ceremonies that elevate and sanctify our lives, but reject all such as are not adapted to the views and habits of, quote, modern civilization. This is all, again, whoever asked me to define modernity, this is all an attempt to define modernity. Right? Anything that doesn't help me be modern, say these rabbis, I reject. Because it is of its own time and not relevant to me today. It has been reformulated or re-articulated or re-understood. It is not an unfolding of a change through time, but a very deliberate transformation of Judaism. So we hold that all such Mosaic and rabbinic laws as regulate diet, priestly purity and dress originated in ages and under the influence of ideas entirely foreign to our present mental and spiritual sense. Quite romantic, right? 1885, the world's getting better. We are more intelligent. We are more spiritual. We are better people than they used to be in those dark ages. And lots of inverted commas in all of this, if it's not entirely obvious, right? Kashrut fails to impress the modern Jew with a spirit of priestly holiness. Their observance in our days is apt rather to obstruct than to further modern spiritual elevation. The quicker we can junk all of these things, the better. That's why you get that meal. And Reform's not in that place anymore, but you can feel energies, balls set in motion during the time of Moses Mendelssohn in Berlin, rolling through to this very kind of sort of satisfied, romantic, modern America in 1885. So I'm just checking time here, 11 minutes. Meanwhile in Eastern Europe, right? So just again, going back to the chronology, while America is gangbusters, just millions of Jews arriving and embracing newness, back in Eastern Europe, nothing has changed. I mean, that's obviously an overstatement, but it's still brutally tough. And there's still an anti-Semitism which is peddling, and I use that word quite literally, old lies about Jews, and it results in Kishinev in a mass slaughter in 1903. And what do the Jews do? The Jews of Israel, they send a poet to report. I mean, this in itself is extraordinary. The national poet of Hebrew, the first great modern Hebrew poet, Chaim Nachum Bialik, goes to Kishinev to report on what happened, and he comes back with a poem. Welcome to Jews. Right? We write poetry after atrocity because we believe in the power of the word in this way. Here we go. This is horrible. Trigger warnings and all of that, right? Descend then to the cellars of the town, there where the virginal daughters of thy folk were fouled, where 7 heathen flung a woman down, the daughter in the presence of her mother, the mother in the presence of her daughter, before slaughter, during slaughter, and after slaughter. Touch with thy hand the cushion stained. Touch. The hatred, the pain, the horror, the ugliness of this mass rape and murder, and I forget the word, corporophilia of what was going on is redolent. But now comes something that bridges us into, I think, a modernity that I think is incredibly important. Right? He doesn't like the people who have done this pogrom at all. But cursed in their shame, they saw it all, Who's he talking about here? The husbands, the men, and the rabbis. They did not stir nor move. They did not pluck their eyes out, nor they beat not their brains against the wall. Perhaps each watcher had it in their heart to pray, a miracle, O Lord, and spare my skin this day. Those who survived this foulness, who from their blood awoke, beheld their life polluted, the light of their world gone out. How did their menfolk bear it? How did they bear this yoke? What did the Jews do? Nothing. How does Bialik feel about that? Makes him ill, makes him angry, and it makes him attack the people who watched on. By the way, what would you have done? Right? What would you have done in that society against that kind of an attack? Right? Let's be empathetic, but let's feel the emotional intensity in how Bialik condemns the weakness of the Jew in Eastern Europe who still sits in the shtetl, ill-educated, unpowered, unable to respond. When we've all seen Fiddler on the Roof, right? When the Cossacks come, they crawled forth from their holes, they fled to the shore, and they gave thanks to God, the sweet benedictory word. The Kohanim sallied forth to the rabbi's house, they flitted. Tell me, O Rabbi, tell, is my own wife permitted? And that's a halacha. If your wife is raped and you're a Kohen, you have to divorce your wife. We can question the misogyny of that another time. But look, that seems to be the concern of these people. The matter ends and nothing more, and all is as it was before. He hates what Judaism in Eastern Europe has become, that pre-modern form of Judaism that was entirely at the whim of the ebbs and flow of history. And what happens to Judaism as a result of that? That's 1903, of course, checking in our moment of Herzl going to the trial of Dreyfus, right, 10 years earlier, not even 10 years, 8 years earlier. People start saying, we've got to change. So this is Max Nordau, who wrote this great titled book, Muskel Judentum, Muscle Jews. We've got to toughen up, says Max Nordau. We've got to start standing up for something before we just get kicked around for too long. What am I talking about? Yes, of course, the physicality of the Zionist settling of the land, right? Those images of the great kibbutznikim dancing the horror and working the land and draining the swamps, and the great military successes of 67 and 73, but also let's just kind of check in that overly vigorous, physical, muscled, don't even try anything with me because I'm going to kick more sand in your face than you could ever kick in my face, that gets us to these, horror stories like Tagmeir, people who kill Palestinians in the name of a kind of Jewish self-defense that is entirely unwarranted. But can you feel what's driven us, what has brought us to this point, that piece of poetry from Bialik and hundreds, thousands of years of that experience? It changes. Now, this isn't, of course, a call to that kind of misbehavior. And this is just a beautiful piece of writing. History is our witness, but once upon a time, Jews had muscles. For too long, all too long, we Jews have been engaged in the mortification of our own flesh. What a sentence. What a word more, right? We have been engaged in our physical no longer going to be here. Or to put it more precisely, as others did the killing for us. We didn't kill ourselves, but we put ourselves in a place where this has happened to us. We would have preferred to develop, sorry about the typo, our bodies rather than to kill them, or have them figuratively and literally, 1898, 1903, killed by others. Let us take up our oldest traditions. Interesting, right? David was a shepherd. Moses was a shepherd. Abraham was a shepherd. Jacob was a shepherd. Right? Let us once more become deep-chested, sturdy, sharp-eyed men. Again, checking the genderedness of that writing. But like, it is a call to find a different kind of Judaism, which doesn't take things lying down and doesn't abdicate the physical in pursuit of what exactly? Well, partly because we've been spending a bunch of time thinking about the spiritual, partly because we haven't had the ability to, I don't know, own guns and own land and work land, but partly we have become complicit in the way in which we have been placed for us. And I just thought I would finish with this as my last slide. The Maccabea is the first Maccabea, I think, is the beginning of the 20th century, a kind of a Jewish Olympics where Jews got sporty. Can you see the Soviet working the land kind of poster type imagery in that poster on the left, 1932? In Tel Aviv, look at the date. It's there, the 28th of March, the 6th of April, and then in Hebrew, Kaf to Kaf Tet Adar Bet. By the way, Rosh Chodesh Adar Bet is next week. This is an interesting time, and I just thought I would try and finish with this sort of nod to 50% of the Jewish population that I have not talked about enough in my history. I know, and I'm not taking it through to the modern age, but if I was, my goodness, it's changed, and it's changed at New London, and so it should. But I just love this, right? These are muscular women. These are women who are doing strong things with their body. They are proud of their body. They are capable of bearing weight with their body for the sake of the art of physicality. The Jew is no longer going to be just somebody who has sand kicked in their face. We're coming back. Well, not until after the Holocaust. And the Holocaust kind of will have to stand as a shadow over the end of this, whatever it is, 5,000-year journey. I am done with slides. That's my attempt to take us through this journey, and for those of you who have joined me for all of it or some of it, and certainly this evening, I'm really grateful. I'll stick around for a few minutes if you've got any questions, but thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.